What's up guys, how you doing? Welcome to another video. So today we've got another DJI Action 2 video coming your way, and we're talking about something that unfortunately has given DJI a fair bit of negative press around the Action 2, and that is all to do with overheating. Right from the very first reviews that started to appear on YouTube, like Peter McKinnon's video, there was talk that this camera seemed to overheat a little bit, and to start with, people kind of said let's see how it goes, and other people thought maybe it was going to be a problem. Well, I talked about it slightly in my first video, but actually I thought we should do a proper video where we really test this out and we see if the Action 2 overheating is going to be a problem. And for you guys who watched my previous video, I know it's called the Action 2. I know it's not the Osmo Action 2, but the whole idea of the previous video was that I was comparing what is, for all intents and purposes, the Osmo Action 2 with the Osmo Action camera, hence why I called it the Osmo Action 2, to kind of get people to see the comparison. But don't worry, as I can see right here on the box, I do know it's the Action 2. I think most people got that. Some people apparently found that a bit more confusing than I had intended to, but we're talking about the DJI Action 2. Before we get into testing this overheating, make sure you do all that usual YouTube stuff for me. Hit the like button, hit the thumbs up on the video, because it helps me out loads and loads, helps my video to be more successful. That's why I ask you to do it, and I really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Loads of other videos to come on this channel that I think you might enjoy, and we've got some more DJI Action 2 videos to come really soon. So, the Action 2, overheating. There have been some issues with this camera, and you guys who've been watching other YouTube reviews will have seen people talk about this, but I wanted to actually do some extensive testing. So that's exactly what I've done. I have pushed my Action 2 to the limits. I've tested it on all different settings, different temperatures, and recorded how long it lasts before it starts to overheat. Going to share all of that information with you today. I think I should put a bit of a caveat with this. I don't recommend doing this with your own Action 2, because ultimately if you push your camera to the limit to the extent where it is giving you an overheating warning, and you do it again and again to test all the different settings, it is not good for your camera. So don't do that. Let me do that. I'll risk mine. Don't risk yours. Don't want anyone to burn out their Action 2. Okay, so how did we do this? Before we get into actually sharing the results, I just thought I should show you kind of what I did to make it a fair and consistent test. The first thing to say is that in between each test, I let the camera cool right the way back down to normal room temperature. Of course, if I tested it on one setting, then straight away tested it on another one, and it hadn't cooled down, that wouldn't be a fair test. So I left it probably, in fact, a good sort of hour, because I did it at different sessions through the day, in between each of the tests to make sure the camera was totally cool before I started each one. Most of the tests were done right here in my office with the camera sat on the table in front of me. I know some people might say that's a problem with some testing, and don't worry, I did something which you'll see at the end of the video to check that as well. But again, all the tests were done in the same environment. I didn't do one like in the blazing sunshine and one in the fridge. I tried to keep it consistent. Okay, so straight up for test number one. The first thing I did was I thought I would set the camera into what I kind of felt was sort of almost like a regular filming mode, something that I would use quite a lot of the time. So for me, I chose 4K 30 frames per second. I also attached it to the screen module to kind of create, I guess, what would be like a regular vlog setup. So 4K 30 frames per second with the screen module attached. Left it right here on the desk and I just let it record. Now I can confirm that it did overheat, but it went all the way to 34 minutes and 3 seconds before I got an overheating warning. Now 34 minutes 3 seconds, that actually for me doesn't feel too bad. I can't imagine that I would ever be filming for more than 34 minutes straight. So for me and my use of the camera, didn't think that was too bad, but it did overheat. 34 minutes and 3 seconds at 4K 30 frames per second. I should also say that was with Rocksteady turned on. So from there I decided to step it up a gear. I went exactly the same, the camera with the screen module attached. This time we went for 4K 60 frames per second. The camera had totally cooled down, I put it on the table and I let it record. So 4K 60 frames per second. It seems as though the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second is quite substantial, because this one overheated at 9 minutes 26 seconds. So about a third of the time, 4K 60 frames per second overheated at just under 9.5 minutes. I then thought, as another bit of a test, I should see how it performs without the screen module attached. I thought potentially it could be that the screen module, of course, is making the camera work harder. Maybe it's adding to the heat. So I tried the exact same test with just the camera module. Again, 4K 60 frames per second. So with the screen module attached, we got 9 minutes 26 seconds. And then with just the camera, again set on the table, we got 11 minutes 44 seconds. So over 2 minutes more with just the camera. So I would assume that's because the extra heat being created by the screen module is reducing the time before the camera overheats. So just under 12 minutes, 4K 60 frames per second with just the camera module. Now, something which I thought would be interesting at this stage was I did the exact same test with the original Osmo Action 1. So the same thing, 4K 60 frames per second, left it right here on the desk. Well, let's just say it outperformed the Action 2, but by a stretch, because it ran all the way to about 35 minutes before I thought, you know what, kind of proved the point, and I turned it off. So over 35 minutes, more than 3 times the amount of time that the Action 2 lasted before it overheated. So then I thought it was time to really step it up. So I added the screen module back on. So we went back to the screen module with the camera, and this time we were going up to the top. We went 4K 120 frames per second, and I left this right here on the table to record. This is where things got interesting, and we really started to see some overheating issues, because at 4K 120 frames per second, this thing only lasted 4 minutes 38 seconds before I got an overheating warning. 4 minutes 38 seconds, that is not long at all, and we'll wait till my conclusion for the video, but for me, that's a problem. I did the exact same test again. I did it without the screen module, so just the camera itself. That gave us an extra bit of time. That lasted 5 minutes and 8 seconds. So we got an extra 30 seconds at 4K 120 frames per second by taking off the screen module. 5 minutes and 8 seconds with just the camera. So as we can see, when we're in that 4K 120 frames per second mode, we really are struggling with that overheating. Now, I thought I should be fair to the camera, give it a go on some other settings. So I also tried it, again, with the screen module attached, at shooting 1080p 30 frames per second. And I left that right here on the side to record. Well, I've got to say, and I guess not surprisingly, that was a lot better. We went all the way to 36 minutes before I stopped the recording and thought, okay, fine, so 1080p 30 frames per second doesn't really seem to be a problem. There might be people who would like me to run that for 2 hours and see if it goes, if you guys are maybe shooting time lapses or something, but for me, 1080p 30 frames per second went plenty long enough. Now we know from the issues with the GoPro Hero 10, GoPro came out and suggested that a lot of the tests that were being done on YouTube were unfair because the camera was being left on a table indoors in not suitable testing environments. That's because it is an action camera, it's supposed to be out there moving about in the fresh air, in the wind, not sat on a table. So I thought, okay, that's fair enough, we will test that more accurately. So what I did was I got the camera module with the screen module attached. I attached it to one of the little attachments that the camera comes with, and it was a nice windy day outside. It was pretty regular temperature. It was about 14 degrees outside, and I went and sat this on the table in the middle of my garden in the fresh air on a fairly windy day. I set it to 4K 60 frames per second. So remembering, when we did that test in here on the table, we got 11 minutes 44 seconds before the camera overheated. So outside in my garden, fresh air, windy day, air moving around the camera, on the little stand right here, and we got 13 minutes 42 seconds. So to be fair, that does increase it. It seems if it's out and about in the fresh air, you do get more time, but still, 13 minutes 42 seconds. Not a huge amount of time when we remember that the Osmo Action, original Osmo Action 1, did over 35 minutes. Now, it was then brought to my attention that within the settings of the camera, you can actually change the levels that this camera has as like resistant to heat. It has two different settings. You can have it set as standard, which it was, and all of these tests that I've done here, it was set to standard. And you can also change it to high. So high as in a higher threshold for overheating before the camera shuts down. Now, I have read online that people in the EU and UK weren't able to get to that option on the menu. Well, I should say I'm in the UK. I bought this camera direct from the DJI website, and I can do it on mine. I can change it. So I don't know if that's something before they updated the firmware, which I did the first day I got the camera, or maybe if I just have one that seems to be working outside of other people based in the UK, or maybe it's an EU rule that doesn't apply to the UK, but either way, I can change the setting in mine. So I did. So for this test, I thought I would go back to one of the more challenging ones. So we went back to 4K 120 frames per second with just the camera module. Now let's remember, with just the camera module sat here on the table, we got 5 minutes and 8 seconds before this overheated. That was with the standard threshold set. I changed that to high and did the test again. Now this was really interesting because this more than doubled the time. It went to 10 minutes 27 seconds before it overheated. So that difference between standard setting and high setting really does seem to make a difference. However, what concerned me about that is that when I finished the test, this camera was hot. And I'm talking like it was nearly too hot to touch against my hand. Especially the front piece here around the screen, that was like really, really hot. It wasn't burning me, like scalding me, but it was uncomfortable for me to hold my hand against it. That's how hot that was getting. Now that can simply not be good for your camera. I really was worried, like, God, have I burnt out the insides of it or something here, because it was really, really hot. I've got to say, I don't think that's a good idea, and actually straight after I changed it back to standard mode because I was worried about that. It was so hot, it genuinely concerned me. So, some tests have been completed. We've tried it with the modular screen, we've tried it without, we've tried it outside in the fresh air. So that kind of brings us to a summary. As I asked at the beginning, do we think the overheating of the Action 2 is a problem? I'm afraid, DJI, I've got to say, absolutely it is. Like, oh my goodness, less than 5 minutes, 4 minutes and 38 something seconds with some of the tests. I mean, that's just not good enough. It's so bad that I've almost thought, like, is this an error? Like, was it supposed to do that? That's crazy, right? People who are out and about shooting some kind of action, to only be able to shoot 4 something minutes of footage, that is just going to be a huge problem. Bearing in mind, the Osmo Action 1 does not have that problem. It really is a concern for me, and of course there are other concerns that people have been reporting about this camera, and that's going to be a whole other video that I'm going to be making. But overheating, is it a problem? Yes. Now, people have already asked, well, does that mean that maybe some firmware updates or something might change it? And I suppose my concern with that is, well, yeah, the firmware updates might enable it to not overheat so quickly, or they might enable you to kind of, do that, changing the threshold to high, maybe in some areas of the world that you can't currently do it. But is it going to fix the fact that the camera was nearly hot enough that it burnt my hand at the end of 4K 120 frames per second shooting? I can't imagine that firmware is going to be able to change that. So I've got to say, really, really worried about the overheating with this camera. Now, rather than just DJI bashing in this video, I think I should say, for me personally, the type of shooting that I intend on doing with this camera, I probably would be okay because I would be shooting 4K 30 frames per second for a lot of the stuff that I would do. Occasionally I would do 120 frames per second slow motion, but that would be like B-roll or like real quick clips, and my longer clips would be normally at 30 frames per second, and even then they're never going to reach the like 30-minute mark that we ran these tests to. So actually for me personally, not a problem. I could quite happily use it. But for people who want to be using it out and about, they're shooting action, maybe using it on FPV drones, stuff like that, I think it really is going to be an issue. So guys, what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Really interested to hear your own findings if you've been using the Action 2. Interested to see your thoughts if you haven't already bought it. Has this put you off, or are you still going to buy one and see how it goes? Let me know in the comments because I'm really interested to hear. If you did enjoy this video, if you found it useful, or even if you just feel bad for me because I put my camera at risk so you didn't have to, do me a favour, hit that like button on the video. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Guys, thank you very much for watching. I will see you on the next video.